Welcome to NBA Jam Tatman QC on Fire Edition. Boom shakalaka!
Happy Little Games. As a wee little peckerwood of 8 years old, I can recall seeing Asteroids for the very first time. The visuals looked very different than what I'd seen before, with its smooth rotating objects and those nasty nefarious UFOs. The control scheme took a bit of practice to wrap around my pea-sized brain, but once I did, I was in heaven. I was not the only one either, as the game would go on to become Atari's biggest selling coin-op, earning over $500 million in its lifetime. Similar to Space Invaders, the game was a phenomenon here in the States, and it was one of the earliest mega hits of the golden age of arcades. What was the inspiration for this game? What TV show sent a cease and desist letter to Ed Logg, the creator of Asteroids? Why did this game use buttons rather than a joystick? Let's find out as we venture into deepest, darkest space and learn about the history of Asteroids. In the early 1970s, college student Ed Logg was hooked on a brand new game. He had played a 4-player version of Space War on a PDP machine at the Stanford Research Lab, and while he wasn't any good at it, there was something about the game that resonated with him. Mr. Logg had joined Atari due to being impressed with its video computer system, otherwise known as the 2600. He had taken the game of Breakout, put his unique spin on it, and created the very successful Super Breakout. After the success of this game, Mr. Logg had a meeting with his boss to discuss another game they were having issues with, initially known as Planet Grab, but then later renamed Cosmos. This was a multiplayer game in which players would shoot each other from the opposite side of the screen, but there was a giant, indestructible asteroid in the middle. Mr. Logg can recall endlessly shooting the asteroid to no avail, but for some reason he liked doing it. Designer Lyle Raines suggested to Mr. Logg that they have a game where they shoot these rocks instead and blow them up. Space Invaders was essentially Breakout, which used a moving gun instead of a paddle and ball, but it also featured endless enemies to be shot down. This would be a two-dimensional combination of both Space War along with the addictive gameplay of Space Invaders. Lyle Raines, VP of Engineering at Atari at the time, had this to say regarding the creation of Asteroids. I guess the way I describe it is that I'm the father of Asteroids. Ed Logg is the mother of Asteroids because he had to live with it for 9 months and deliver a finished product. All I had to do was provide the seed. After the game's concept was decided upon between the two, Mr. Raines wanted to do it as a typical raster game, but Mr. Logg wanted to do it using vector technology. The higher resolution of the vectors meant that they could have more control of where you were aiming at. The proprietary board was dubbed the Digital Vector Generator, or DVG, and was actually created off-campus at a research lab in Grass Valley, California. The vector title Mr. Logg got his feet wet with was the very first Atari vector release, which was Lunar Lander and was created by Howard Delman. Mr. Delman loved Ed's idea and recalled another game that went nowhere, which was titled Planet Grab, in which 2 players flew around the screen trying to claim and steal as many planets from each other as possible. The game was not fun to play, so it was shelved, but he knew this would be the perfect starting point for Asteroids. Once it was decided upon that Asteroids would use vector technology, a modified version of the Lunar Lander board was sent to Mr. Logg and his team. The original Lunar Lander PCB started out life with a satellite board connected to the bottom, which produced sounds for the game. While Mr. Logg was waiting for the finished hardware to be completed, his very first job was to get the game's basic concepts written down on paper. As you can see from this original planning document that was prepared by Mr. Logg, the completed game is almost exactly as he describes it. Also worth taking a look at are the original hand-drawn sketches for both the player ship and the asteroids themselves. The saucer and explosions came out pretty much as it was initially laid out on paper. While working on Asteroids, Lyle Raines had this to say. When we were working on Asteroids, I would play Asteroids for a number of hours in the evening, then I'd go home and close my eyes, and as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd see the asteroids floating around the screen. It didn't take long before he had a tiny triangular ship flying around through the blackness of space, but initially he had toyed with the idea of having no friction to decrease the forward movement of the ship. Also, a lot of those early battles on Space War helped influence the way the game was played. To keep the game from becoming mundane, he had programmed different sized asteroids but felt something else was needed to keep the player moving. This was where the idea of the UFOs came in. He had always wanted two different sized saucers, a big one that fired randomly and a little one that would just chase you down. Also, to increase tension, he had employed a timer that steadily decreased, meaning that saucer attacks steadily increased. He also included a hyperspace button, which could be used in a pinch, but it was totally random where your ship would reappear. Speaking of the buttons, the game would use 5 buttons for controls with nary a joystick in sight. This was done to give you more precise controls over your ship. The game proved so popular at Atari headquarters during development that employees would frequently wait in line for a chance to play. The interruptions became so bad that they had to build a separate prototype just for the co-workers to play. It was at this point they realized they had a hit. As a matter of fact, when the game was first put on test at Golfland in Sunnyvale, California, the arcade operator had to increase the size of the container that they were using to catch the quarters due to the immense popularity. Something else that proved this game was going to be a hit was something Mr. Log experienced firsthand. When we field tested Asteroids for the very first time, I saw a player start a game and die 3 times, each within 20 seconds. He proceeded to put another quarter in. This tells me the player felt it was his fault he died and he was convinced he could do better. This is one of the primary goals a game designer tries to achieve, and it was clear to me Asteroids had it. During its development, the small and large saucers were known internally as Mr. Bill and Sluggo. This was unknown to the public until it was revealed in a February 1981 article in Esquire magazine, and in particular the side article, How to Win at Asteroids. However, a cease and desist letter was sent from the IP holders of the Mr. Bill show, asking that they please refrain from referring to the saucers as Mr. Bill and Sluggo.
No!
Something that folks who played the original arcade game had a fondness for was the glow that permeates from the player's ship, giving the impression of a vapor trail flowing out from behind your ship. This was completely unintentional and was nothing more than the phosphor of the ship's outline on the monitor as it moves from a stationary spot. This was something that needed to be seen on an actual Asteroids machine. Asteroids turned out to be such a massive hit that it overtook Space Invaders in 1980. Reports were that the game was making over $1,000 a week in earnings, allowing the capital investment of the arcade unit to be repaid in a matter of days. Atari sales director Don Osborne said in 1980 that Asteroids, at the height of its popularity, easily took in $10 million a week in quarters. The game has earned a reported $3 billion adjusted for inflation since its inception. Asteroids was released by Atari and smashed its way into arcades in 1979. As the story goes, blow up all the rocks and shoot the flying saucers. Honestly, when the game was released in the arcades back in the day, there wasn't a story. The Atari 2600 version released some cockamamie story about space cosmic patrols being caught in the middle of an asteroid field, and the only chance for survival is to destroy the various boulders. This is a 1 or 2 player shoot and survive extravaganza in which you have to destroy all the boulders while watching out for those pesky flying saucers. These are not the cute Kang and Kodos type, as they will kill you deader than a doornail. The game uses buttons for control of your ship rather than a joystick, as the developers felt this would be a bit more precise. You have left and right rotation buttons, which turns your ship left or right. There is a thrust button, which will move your ship forward in the direction the nose of your ship is pointing. You have your trusty, but perhaps rusty, fire button, which obviously fires missiles at the asteroids and UFOs. And finally, the hyperspace button, which will enable your ship to disappear and reappear instantly somewhere on the screen. One problem with this, though, is that it's totally random where it pops up. Typically, this is only used in emergencies. The goal of each screen is to clear all the asteroids and flying saucers as quickly and efficiently as possible. There are 3 types of asteroids: small, medium, and large, with all of the asteroids appearing large when each level starts. Each asteroid will get smaller and smaller until they finally disappear the more you shoot them. Only 26 asteroids can appear on screen at once. To make matters worse and to keep you from staying idle, flying saucers will appear with a larger saucer able to fire at you and a small saucer sticking to you like stink on a skunk. Thankfully, bonus lives are awarded every 10,000 points. Keep in mind that you can only have 255 lives before the game could potentially crash. To achieve this crazy number of lives, you have to use the lurking exploit. This involved a lurking strategy by keeping just 1 or 2 asteroids in play and destroying the saucers to accumulate points indefinitely with little risk to the player. After Atari was informed of this, they issued a patched EEPROM which fixed the problem. This also led to the creation of Asteroids Deluxe. The first 200 Asteroids machines were actually lunar lander cabinets. Asteroids was so successful that Atari cut Lunar Lander's production and released the 200 aforementioned machines, complete with their original Lunar Lander cabinet art. 3 different cabinets were offered, including a full upright, cabaret, and cocktail format. While there wasn't a whole lot of merchandise available, there were some odds and ends that did make its way to the market, including buttons that were sponsored in a partnership with Coca-Cola, a read-along adventure, which was a record album and picture book that included the story of Asteroids, t-shirts, an Atari sleeping bag that featured Asteroids as one of the games, posters, and a Halloween costume that featured the asteroid itself as the mask. There was also a McDonald's scratch-off game that featured some of Atari's biggest properties, such as Missile Command and Asteroids. This led to another classic early 1980s commercial.
Asteroids, Centipede, Missile Command, Star Raiders. The thrills of winning are all at McDonald's. You can win Atari home video and computer prizes and McDonald's food. Purchase may be required to redeem food prizes. Just scratch the card and match 2 dots without getting zapped. Sometimes you win, sometimes, because every card can be a winner. Taste the thrill of Atari.
Asteroids made its big screen debut in the 1982 movie Fast Times at Ridgemont High. It also appeared briefly in the arcade scene in the movie War Games. Speaking of the big screen, the game was also mentioned in the movie National Lampoon's Vacation. It also made a rather memorable appearance on The Simpsons. Asteroids even inspired a song by Buckner and Garcia called Hyperspace, which was released on the Pac-Man Fever album. The game turned out to be a monster success, so Atari quickly brought to market Asteroids Deluxe in 1981. This was more of an Asteroids 1.5, which still used monochrome vector graphics. This game was in direct response to arcade operators who had complained that expert players on the original could play for hours, costing them precious revenue and preventing other players from having a turn. This new game would fix the lurking exploit and also introduce some different types of enemies, such as the Death Star, which after shooting it once will blow up into 3 different wedges, which will pursue you more quickly. Your ship now has a shield instead of hyperspace, and the accuracy of the large and small saucers has been improved. Other modifications included graphical backdrops, which gives the game a bit of color and the impression of depth. An extra digit was added to the score count, so now the score rolls over at 999,990 instead of 99,990. In 1982, Atari released the color vector game Space Duel. It's not clear if this was an official follow-up or just a spiritual successor, so I'll just mention it rather quickly. Although the copyright date is 1981, the game officially did not make it into the arcades until early 1982. This is a follow-up to Asteroids Deluxe, and as I mentioned, this uses a cool color vector display. Something else that is pretty sweet is that it offered 2 players simultaneously. It was even possible for one player to double his firepower by controlling 2 ships that were tethered together. The asteroids have been replaced with colorful geometric shapes like diamonds, cubes, and spinning pinwheels. This game was nowhere near as successful as Deluxe or the original arcade game, but it was still a lot of fun to play in my opinion. Asteroids was released in the arcades in 1987. This game did away with the previous vector graphics and finally utilized raster graphics. Due to this, a lot more conversions were produced for all the major home computer formats at the time. The gameplay is basically the same as the original, in which you take control of a rotating ship which uses thrust to give the player momentum. You have to destroy the various asteroids, but this time, your ship has a limited amount of fuel to generate thrust with. The fuel comes in the form of energy that can also be used for the ship's shields. Once all the energy is depleted, the player's ship is destroyed. Your ship can also be transformed at will into 3 different versions, with a speeder, which has the greatest speed, the fighter with the most firepower, and warrior, which has extra armor. There are 4 different difficulty settings, each one with several different galaxies. There are now even boss characters you have to contend with. The game also offers 2 players simultaneously. It's a fun little update, and it expands upon the gameplay of the original immensely. While the graphics look nice, I'll always have a soft spot for those warm, glowing vectors. Accolade, who was known for releasing some pretty stellar Commodore 64 games, released a 2-pack of Missile Command and Asteroids for the original Game Boy. Rather than having a black background with ships and boulders, you now have a white background with gray colored objects. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but overall it's not bad. This features 2 different versions of Asteroids. One is the original vector style game, and the other is an updated version with 3-dimensional asteroids and ships. Due to only having 2 buttons at your command, sacrifices were made to the controls, but overall it works pretty good. The audio is not that great, and it borders on getting a gold star in queefiness. totally different version was also released for the original Game Boy, this time with updated visuals and play mechanics. The black background makes its return with the ships and everything else having a retro 3D feel to it. There are also a number of different enemies and levels for you to play through. The original arcade game was included in 1993's Microsoft Arcade compilation. Over the years, they have constantly tried to update the original by adding better graphics and new features. In 1995, Super Asteroids and Missile Command was released for the Atari Lynx. This was two games combined into a single cartridge, which just so happened to be the final game released for Atari's little handheld. The graphics and sound have been enhanced utilizing once again raster graphics instead of vectors. The gameplay is pretty much identical, except while killing all the UFOs and destroying the asteroids, you can occasionally grab a power-up. The Nintendo 64 even saw a version which was entitled Asteroids Hyper 64, which made the ship and asteroids 3D, which also added brand new weapons and 4 players simultaneously. It included 15 different enemies and 5 bosses. The boulders themselves were also updated, including heat-seeking asteroids which will zero in on the player. In 2001, Atari Anniversary Edition was released for the Dreamcast, PlayStation, and Windows. This included emulated versions of Asteroids and other games. This also included the Atari 2600 version, which I will cover in just a few minutes. Asteroids was also released for the Game Boy Advance in 2005. Xbox Live Arcade received a version of Asteroids in 2007, which included HD graphics and a more intense gameplay mode. It was also part of Atari's Greatest Hits Volume 1 for the Nintendo DS. It was also announced back in 2018 for the Intellivision Amico. I tried holding my breath waiting for it to be released, but I quickly turned blue and gave up. And finally, a remake, Asteroids Recharged, was released in 2021 for all the current platforms, including the Nintendo Switch. The game is a neon-colored remake of the original, and honestly, it looks really cool. There are lots of particle effects and neon, which gives the effect of the original arcade title back in 1979. There are power-ups as well, which makes for an excellent update for an already excellent game. Also returning to the arcades sometime in 2024, a full 45 years since the original debuted back in 1979, is Asteroids Recharged. This is a 3-player simultaneous game of asteroids on steroids, and it is absolutely fantastic. Anyone who knows me knows I love tabletop arcade games. A very cool Asteroids tabletop was released and it looks spectacular. The only downside is that it uses a joystick rather than buttons to control your ship. The wizards at Arcade 1UP even introduced the Partycade portable home arcade machine, which included 8 different Vector Atari classics including Lunar Lander, Super Breakout, Tempest, and Asteroids. Unlike the tabletop game which used a joystick, this version replicated the arcade's button controls. Arcade 1UP even introduced a 4-foot-tall version. Also, the masterminds at New Wave Toys introduced a tabletop version which even replicated the arcade's original controls.
Dear Atari Anonymous, ever since my husband Luno returned from Earth with Asteroids, the new Atari home video game, he and the rest of the family do nothing but play Asteroids. Luno says Asteroids is good practice for his interplanetary life.
Bitty bitty? Bitty bitty?
Tell me, dear Atari Anonymous, with everybody hooked on Asteroids, what on earth is a poor Martian mother to do?
New Atari Asteroids, now available for your home.
If you were fortunate enough to have an Atari 2600 growing up, then more than likely one of the cartridges you had to have was Asteroids. Atari shouted from the rooftops that the only way to play this game at home was on an official Atari system, so very few conversions were actually produced. The title ended up shifting 3 million copies for the Atari VCS alone. Before we get into the official ones, let me mention that this is one of the most cloned games on the market, right up there with Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. Some of these clones even surpass the official ones made by Atari. The Apple II, TRS-80, Commodore 64, and even the BBC all received spectacular versions, although not official. One homebrew that definitely deserves a mention that would have been perfect back in the day was Rockaroids for the Vectrex. Thanks to the vector technology of the Vectrex, this conversion is probably one of the most accurate in terms of presentation that is not emulated. The first official home release was for the Atari 2600, and all in all, it turned out pretty good. Gone are the vectors, having been replaced with raster graphics, but it does a good job at representing the original arcade game. The original arcade buttons have also been replaced with a joystick and a single fire button, but after a bit of practice, it controls really well. All of the asteroids are multicolored, giving the game a bit of flair. The sound effects are not too bad, and it does include the rapidly increasing heartbeat. For a home conversion in the early 1980s, this turned out really well. The game was also released for the Atari line of computers, and while it has a few more features than the 2600 version and high resolution, in my opinion, it actually looks a bit worse than the VCS. All of the asteroids are blue, and they sometimes tend to blend together. With this version though, 4 players could play simultaneously, either cooperatively or competitively. A very cool trick, especially back in 1981. As far as the controls go, it plays very similar to the 2600. The Atari 7800 received its very own version, developed in 1984, but was not released until 1986. This port was intended to show off the graphical capabilities of the 7800 and featured some nicely detailed spherical asteroids that appear 3D in appearance. This one also allows 2 players to compete simultaneously, either cooperatively or competitively. Sound effects are decent and it plays just as you would expect. Also worth mentioning is Geometry Wars. This game started out life as a minigame in Project Gotham Racing 2, but it was so popular they eventually released Geometry Wars Retro Evolved. If you ever wanted to play Asteroids with the effects of being on LSD, then you should definitely check this game out. The controls use the twin stick method similar to Robotron and Smash TV, but the gameplay is more similar to our beloved Asteroids. And there you have it, everyone, the history of Asteroids. This is one that has been requested more than a few times over the years, but I wasn't quite sure if there was enough interest in the title to do it. There's nothing worse than spending 20 plus hours on a video and then the general public ends up not liking it. In this case though, there was a lot of little known facts and bonus clips I was able to put in, so hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Asteroids is one of my earliest gaming memories along with Space Invaders, and it's one of those games I tend to go back to time and time again. If you've never had the chance to blow up some rocks, all the while avoiding those pesky little space aliens, be sure and give this game a shot. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. If you would like to contribute but not sign up for my Patreon, you can always click the donate button up above. Thanks everyone for watching.